Before we dive into this incredible story, drop a comment below and tell us what city you're watching from. And don't forget to rate this story from 0 to 10 when we reach the end. Now let's begin. The fluorescent lights in the campus library flickered slightly as rain drummed against the tall windows, creating a rhythmic backdrop to the quiet scratching of pencils and the soft rustling of turning pages. Emma Chen sat at her usual corner table on the third floor, surrounded by textbooks, highlighters, and scattered notes covering everything from calculus to organic chemistry. Her black-framed glasses slipped down her nose as she leaned over a particularly challenging problem set, her dark hair pulled into a messy bun that suggested she'd been here for hours. She had in fact been here since 6 in the morning, long before most students had even considered leaving their dorm rooms. This was her sanctuary, her second home, the place where everything made sense in a world that often felt overwhelming and unpredictable. Emma wasn't wealthy like so many of her classmates at Riverside University, one of the most prestigious institutions on the East Coast. She was here on a full academic scholarship, the kind that required maintaining a perfect grade point average and working 20 hours a week in the campus bookstore just to cover her minimal living expenses. While other students complained about their allowances or debated which luxury car their parents should buy them for graduation, Emma carefully budgeted every dollar, choosing the dining hall's cheapest options and wearing the same rotation of thrift store clothes she'd owned since freshman year. But none of that mattered when she was solving problems, when numbers and formulas aligned in beautiful logical patterns that rewarded hard work and clear thinking, rather than family connections or inherited wealth. A soft cough interrupted her concentration. Emma looked up to find a guy standing awkwardly beside her table, shifting his weight from foot to foot like he wasn't quite sure he should be there. He was tall, probably just over 6 feet, with slightly messy brown hair that looked like he'd run his fingers through it too many times and dark eyes that seemed uncertain despite his athletic build. He wore an expensive-looking gray hoodie and designer jeans that Emma's trained eye recognized as costing more than her entire month's food budget, yet somehow he managed to look uncomfortable in them, like someone wearing a costume that didn't quite fit. "Excuse me," he said, his voice quiet and almost apologetic. "Are you Emma Chen, the one who tutors for free at the student center?" Emma nodded slowly, setting down her mechanical pencil. "Yes, that's me. Can I help you with something?" The guy glanced around as if checking whether anyone was watching them, then pulled out the chair across from her without waiting for an invitation. He dropped a heavy backpack on the table with a thud that made her carefully organized notes flutter. "I'm Jake," he said simply, not offering a last name. "I'm failing calculus. Well, not just calculus, pretty much everything except physical education. My advisor said if I don't pull my grades up this semester, I'm going to be on academic probation, and if that happens..." He trailed off, looking down at his hands. "Let's just say it would be really bad." Emma studied him for a moment, noting the genuine distress in his expression, despite the obviously expensive clothes and the watch on his wrist that probably cost more than her entire year's tuition. She'd tutored dozens of students over the past 3 years, and she'd developed a sixth sense for distinguishing between those who genuinely wanted help and those who just wanted someone to do their work for them. Something about Jake's defeated posture and the dark circles under his eyes suggested he belonged to the former category. "What's your major?" she asked, pulling out a fresh notebook from her bag. Jake grimaced. "Business administration. Not exactly by choice. It's kind of expected in my family." There was something bitter in his tone, something that suggested layers of complexity Emma didn't have time to unpack. "And what's your biggest challenge with calculus specifically? Is it the concepts, the application, or the foundational algebra?" He stared at her like she'd just spoken a foreign language. "Honestly? All of it. Numbers and I have never been friends. I can memorize plays for football. I can read people in negotiations. I can even speak 3 languages, but put an equation in front of me, and my brain just shuts down." Emma felt a familiar spark of challenge ignite in her chest. She loved problems like this. Students who'd been told they couldn't do something and had started to believe it themselves. "Okay," she said, flipping to a blank page. "First rule, you're not stupid. Your brain works differently, which means we need to find the way that works for you. Second rule, I don't do the work for you. I teach you how to do it yourself. And third rule, you show up on time, you come prepared, and you actually try. Can you commit to those 3 things?" Jake looked at her with something like surprise, as if he hadn't expected such direct terms. Then, slowly, a small smile crossed his face, the first genuine expression she'd seen from him. "Yeah," he said. "I can do that." "Good. When's your next calculus exam?" 2 weeks, Jake answered, pulling out a crumpled syllabus from his backpack that looked like it had been stuffed in there and forgotten for months. Emma smoothed it out on the table, scanning the topics with a practiced eye. Derivatives, limits, applications of differentiation, the beginning of integration. Challenging material for someone who struggled with math, but not impossible if they put in consistent work. 2 weeks, Emma repeated, already mentally calculating how many sessions they'd need. "That's tight but doable. Can you meet me here every evening at 7? We'll need at least 2 hours per session." Jake's face fell slightly. "Evenings are tough. I have football practice until 6, and then team dinners on Mondays and Wednesdays, and there's this thing on Fridays that I can't really get out of." Emma held up a hand, stopping his list of excuses before it could grow longer. She'd heard variations of this speech before from students who wanted help but weren't willing to prioritize it. "Jake, let me be clear. I'm offering to help you for free, using time I could spend studying for my own classes or working extra shifts. If you want this to work, you need to make it a priority. Not the only priority, but a priority. Otherwise, we're both wasting our time." Something shifted in Jake's expression, a flash of what looked like respect mixed with chagrin. Emma wondered if many people spoke to him this directly. "You're right," he said after a moment. "I'll make it work." 7 o'clock. Starting tomorrow? "Starting today," Emma corrected. "We're here now. You have your textbook, and I have 2 hours before my shift at the bookstore. No time like the present. For the next 2 hours." Emma discovered that Jake hadn't been exaggerating about his difficulties with math. His understanding of basic algebraic principles had gaps you could drive a truck through, and his approach to problem-solving was scattershot at best. But she also discovered something else. When he finally understood a concept, when the light bulb moment happened, his entire face transformed with genuine joy, like a kid discovering magic for the first time. He wasn't lazy or entitled despite his obvious wealth. He was someone who'd been struggling alone for a long time, probably too proud or too afraid to ask for help until the situation became desperate. By the time Emma glanced at her phone and realized she had 15 minutes to get across campus to the bookstore, they'd made it through the fundamental concepts of limits, and Jake had successfully solved 3 practice problems on his own. "Same time tomorrow," she said, gathering her materials quickly. "And Jake? Do the practice problems on pages 73 through 75 tonight. Don't just read them, actually work through them. We'll review them tomorrow." Jake nodded, looking more energized than when he'd first approached her table. "Emma?" he called as she was about to leave. "Thank you. Really. I know you don't have to do this." She paused, adjusting her backpack on her shoulder. "Everyone deserves a chance to succeed," she said simply. "See you tomorrow." As Emma hurried across campus, dodging puddles and pulling her thin jacket tighter against the autumn chill, she thought about Jake's expensive clothes and obvious privilege. She wondered what it must be like to have resources like that and still struggle, to have every material advantage but lack the one thing that had always come naturally to her: the ability to understand and manipulate numbers and logic. In some ways, she thought, maybe they weren't so different after all. They both felt like outsiders at Riverside, just for opposite reasons. The bookstore shift passed in its usual blur of scanning textbooks, directing confused freshmen to the right sections, and restocking shelves. Emma's manager, Mrs. Rodriguez, was a kind woman in her 50s, who often looked the other way when Emma grabbed a coffee from the faculty lounge or snuck in some studying during slow periods. "You look tired, mija," Mrs. Rodriguez commented as Emma was clocking out at 10. "Burning the candle at both ends again?" "Just trying to keep all the plates spinning," Emma replied with a weary smile. "You know how it is." Mrs. Rodriguez gave her a concerned look, the kind that suggested she wanted to say more but respected Emma's independence too much to push. "Just remember to take care of yourself, too." "Can't pour from an empty cup," Emma nodded, even though she knew she'd ignore the advice just like she always did. Rest was a luxury she couldn't afford, not when one bad semester could cost her everything she'd worked for. The walk back to her dorm took 20 minutes through the dimly lit campus paths. Emma's roommate was already asleep when she finally made it back to their tiny shared room. She brushed her teeth quietly, changed into her worn pajamas, and climbed into bed. But sleep didn't come immediately. Instead, she found herself thinking about Jake and his admission that business administration wasn't his choice, but his family's expectation. She wondered what it would be like to have your path chosen for you, to have resources and opportunities but no freedom to pursue your own dreams. Emma had grown up with nothing. A single mother who worked 2 jobs, an apartment where they counted pennies and stretched every dollar. But she'd always had the freedom to dream her own dreams, to choose her own direction. Maybe, she thought as she finally drifted off, wealth came with its own kind of poverty. True to his word, Jake showed up at the library the next evening at exactly 7 o'clock, slightly out of breath and smelling faintly of grass and sweat from football practice. But he was there. He had his textbook, his notebook, and he'd actually attempted most of the practice problems Emma had assigned. Over the following days, their tutoring sessions fell into a comfortable rhythm. Emma would arrive first, claiming their corner table and setting up her materials. Jake would appear within minutes, usually carrying 2 coffees, one for himself and one for Emma, despite her initial protests. "You're doing me a favor," he'd said the first time he brought her one. "Least I can do is keep you caffeinated." As they worked through derivatives and rate of change problems, Emma began to notice things about Jake that contradicted her initial impressions. Despite his expensive clothes and obvious athletic build, he was surprisingly humble and self-deprecating. When he got answers wrong, which was often at first, he'd laugh at his mistakes rather than getting defensive or frustrated. He listened intently when Emma explained concepts, asking thoughtful questions that showed he was genuinely trying to understand rather than just memorize formulas. "Why does this work?" he'd ask, pointing at a particular step in a problem. Like, "I can see that it works mathematically. But why?" Emma found these questions refreshing. So many students just wanted the answers, the shortcuts, the minimum required to pass. Jake wanted to understand the underlying principles, even if the understanding came slowly and with considerable effort. During their 3rd session, while they were working through a particularly challenging word problem, Jake's phone buzzed insistently on the table. He glanced at it, and Emma saw his jaw tighten almost imperceptibly before he flipped it face down and returned his attention to the problem. "You can answer that if you need to," Emma said, though part of her was testing whether he'd actually prioritize their session. "It's fine," Jake replied, his tone suggesting it was anything but fine. "Just family stuff. It can wait." The phone buzzed again. And again. Finally, after the 5th buzz, Jake sighed and picked it up. "Sorry, I need to take this. It'll just be a minute." He walked a few tables away, but in the quiet library, Emma couldn't help but overhear fragments of the conversation. "Yes, Father. I'm studying," Jake said, his voice tight. "No, I haven't forgotten about the dinner on Saturday. Yes, I know how important it is." There was a long pause during which Emma could hear the tinny sound of a voice speaking rapidly on the other end. Jake's shoulders hunched forward slightly, his free hand rubbing the back of his neck in what Emma was beginning to recognize as a stress response. "I'm doing my best," Jake said quietly. "I know that hasn't been good enough, but I'm trying to fix it. I got a tutor." "No, not one of the paid ones, someone actually good." Yes, I'll be ready for the exam. When he returned to the table a few minutes later, the easygoing demeanor Emma had become accustomed to had been replaced by visible tension. His hands gripped his pencil too tightly, and his attempts at the next problem were careless, rushed, nothing like his usual methodical approach. Want to take a break? Emma suggested gently. Jake looked up, surprised, then seemed to realize how tightly wound he'd become. He set down his pencil and leaned back in his chair, closing his eyes for a moment. Sorry, he said. Family pressure. It's a lot sometimes. Emma hesitated, then decided to break her usual rule about keeping things professional and focused purely on academics. What do they expect from you? Jake opened his eyes and looked at her, seeming to weigh how much to share. Everything, he finally said. Perfect grades, perfect performance on the field, perfect business acumen, perfect social connections. My father has this whole plan for my life mapped out, and every time I deviate from it or struggle with any part of it, I'm reminded of how I'm failing to live up to the family name. That sounds exhausting, Emma said simply. It is, Jake admitted, and she could hear the relief in his voice at being able to say it out loud. Sometimes I think about what it would be like to just be a normal student, you know? To struggle without it being a family crisis. To choose my own path without disappointing everyone who has expectations for me. Emma thought about her own mother, who'd never pressured her to be anything except happy and kind. Who'd supported her dreams of college even though it meant Emma moving away and leaving her alone. Who'd worked extra shifts to help Emma buy a decent laptop for school, insisting it was an investment in their future. Expectations can be a burden, Emma said carefully. But at least people are paying attention to you, wanting you to succeed. Some of us have to fight just to be seen at all. Jake looked at her with new attention, and Emma realized she'd revealed more than she'd intended. You're right, he said. I'm sorry. I'm sitting here complaining about family pressure when you're managing to excel without any of the resources I take for granted. That's pretty ungrateful of me. Emma shook her head quickly. That's not what I meant. I wasn't trying to make it a competition about who has it harder. Different challenges are still challenges, even if they come from different circumstances. Jake studied her for a long moment, something thoughtful and almost wondering in his expression. You're different from most people here, you know that? You don't play the usual games. Don't care about the social hierarchies and all the superficial stuff that everyone else seems obsessed with. I don't have time for games, Emma said with a slight smile. I'm too busy trying to keep my scholarship and not become a walking zombie from exhaustion. And yet you're spending 2 hours every evening helping me for free when you could be sleeping or working extra hours for actual money. Jake's observation hung in the air between them. Why do you do it, Emma? Really? Emma considered the question, something she'd asked herself more than once when she was running on 4 hours of sleep and struggling to keep up with her own coursework. Because I believe everyone deserves access to education and support, not just people who can afford expensive tutors. Because I was lucky enough to have teachers who believed in me when I was growing up, who stayed after school to help me even though they weren't getting paid for it. Because maybe if I help enough people, I can make the system a little less unfair, even if it's just one student at a time. Jake was quiet for several seconds, and when Emma looked up from the textbook, she was startled to find him looking at her with an intensity that made her suddenly aware of how close they were sitting, how the library had grown quiet around them as other students gradually left for the evening. You're kind of amazing, Jake said softly. Has anyone ever told you that? Emma felt her cheeks grow warm, and she quickly looked back down at the problem set, pushing her glasses up her nose in a nervous gesture. I'm just a person trying to do the right thing. That's not amazing, that's basic human decency. No, Jake said, and there was something in his voice that made Emma's heart beat a little faster. It's not. Most people talk about fairness and helping others, but when it comes down to it, they prioritize themselves. You actually live your values even when it costs you something. That is amazing, whether you want to admit it or not. The moment stretched between them, charged with something Emma didn't want to examine too closely. She'd been so focused on surviving, on checking off the boxes that would lead to her future career, that she'd barely thought about relationships, or romance, or any of the things other college students seemed to prioritize. And Jake was exactly the kind of distraction she couldn't afford. Complicated, from a completely different world, struggling with his own issues. Besides, she reminded herself firmly, he was her student. This was a professional relationship, even if neither of them was being paid. Getting emotionally involved would be a mistake on every level. "We should get back to work," Emma said, breaking the moment deliberately. "You have 6 more problems to get through, and I need to understand where you're still getting stuck before our next session." Jake blinked, seeming to shake himself out of whatever thoughts he'd been lost in, and nodded. "Right. Sorry, next problem." But something had shifted between them. An acknowledgement of connection that couldn't be entirely ignored or forgotten. For the rest of the session, Emma caught Jake looking at her when he thought she wasn't paying attention. His expression thoughtful in a way that had nothing to do with calculus. As the days passed and Jake's exam drew closer, Emma began to see real improvement. He was starting to recognize patterns, to approach problems with more confidence and less fear. His practice test scores climbed from failing, to barely passing, to actually respectable. And with his growing mathematical confidence came a broader transformation. He smiled more easily, joked about his mistakes instead of getting tense, even started helping other students who looked confused in their calculus class. "You're a good teacher," he told Emma one evening as they were packing up their materials. "Like, really good. Have you ever thought about doing this professionally? Not just volunteering, but actually making it a career?" Emma paused, considering. "I'm planning to go into data science or financial analysis. More stable career path, better pay. Teaching doesn't really make sense financially, especially when I'll have student loans to pay off." "But you love it," Jake observed. "I can see it in your face when I finally understand something you've been trying to explain. You light up like someone just gave you the best gift ever." Emma laughed, surprised by his perceptiveness. "Maybe. But loving something and being able to afford to do it are 2 different things. That's a luxury I don't have." "That's really sad," Jake said quietly, "that our system is set up so that people with genuine talent and passion for teaching are pushed into other careers, because we don't value education enough to pay teachers what they're worth." Emma looked at him with surprise. "That's a pretty progressive take for a business administration major." Jake grinned. "Who says business and social consciousness have to be mutually exclusive? Maybe that's exactly what the business world needs. More people who actually care about making things better instead of just maximizing profits." The night before Jake's calculus exam, Emma met him at the library at 6 instead of their usual 7, wanting to give him extra time for final review and confidence building. But when he arrived, he looked exhausted, with dark circles under his eyes that suggested he hadn't slept much the night before. "Rough night?" Emma asked as he dropped into his usual chair. Jake rubbed his face with both hands. "Couldn't sleep. Kept running through formulas in my head and panicking that I'd forget everything when I actually saw the exam. Plus my father called last night to remind me that failure isn't an option, and that our family doesn't accept mediocrity." There was a defeated quality to his voice that Emma hadn't heard before, even in their earliest sessions. "Jake, look at me," Emma said firmly. He raised his eyes to meet hers. "You are prepared. We've done the work. We've covered all the material and you've demonstrated that you understand the concepts. You're not going to fail. But what if I do?" The vulnerability in his question made Emma's chest tighten. "What if I freeze up, or make stupid mistakes, or just completely blank when I see the first problem? What if all this work was for nothing, and I let you down, and prove my father right that I'm not smart enough to handle this?" Emma reached across the table and did something she'd never done before. She placed her hand over Jake's, stopping his anxious, fidgeting with his pencil. The gesture surprised both of them, but she didn't pull away. "First, you could never let me down. You've shown up every single session. You've done the work. You've tried your absolute hardest. That's all anyone can ask. Second, you are smart enough. Your intelligence just works differently, and that's not a weakness. It's just a difference. And third, whatever happens tomorrow doesn't define your worth as a person. It's one exam in one class in one semester of your life. Jake's hand turned under hers, his fingers curling around her palm. When did you become so wise? When I had to grow up faster than most people my age, Emma said honestly. When I learned that the world isn't always fair, but that doesn't mean we stop trying. When I watched my mom work herself to exhaustion to give me opportunities she never had, and I promised myself I'd make it count. They sat like that for a moment, hands linked across the scattered papers and textbooks, in a small bubble of quiet connection while the library bustled around them with other students cramming for their own exams. Then, Emma gently pulled her hand back, clearing her throat and trying to restore some professional boundaries. Okay, she said briskly. Let's do a final review. Not trying to cram new information, just reinforcing what you already know. And then you're going back to your dorm to get at least 7 hours of sleep because a rested brain performs infinitely better than an exhausted one. For the next 2 hours, they walked through practice problems, with Emma focusing on building Jake's confidence rather than introducing any new concepts. By the time they finished, some of the tension had eased from his shoulders, and he was solving problems with the steady competence he'd developed over their weeks of work together. You've got this, Emma said as they were leaving the library. Remember to read each problem carefully. Show your work so you can get partial credit even if the final answer is wrong. And don't spend too much time on any one question. If you get stuck, move on and come back to it later. Jake nodded, absorbing her test-taking strategies. Then, impulsively, he pulled her into a quick hug. Emma stiffened in surprise. They'd maintained such careful professional distance throughout their sessions, but found herself relaxing into it, her arms coming up to return the embrace. Thank you, Jake murmured into her hair. For everything, for believing in me when I didn't believe in myself. When he pulled back, Emma had to blink away unexpected moisture in her eyes. Go get some sleep, she said, her voice a little rough. And text me after the exam to let me know how it went. She watched him walk away across the dark campus, his backpack slung over one shoulder, and felt a strange mixture of pride and melancholy. In just 2 weeks, Jake had become more than a student to her, though she was afraid to examine exactly what he had become. And once the exam was over, once he no longer needed her help, would they simply go back to being strangers passing each other on campus paths? The next day dragged interminably for Emma. She had 2 of her own classes and a shift at the bookstore, but her mind kept wandering to Jake and his exam, wondering how he was doing, whether the material she'd taught him was enough. She checked her phone obsessively between customers, waiting for his text. It finally came at 4 in the afternoon, just as Emma was restocking a shelf of biology textbooks. Exam done. I think I actually passed. Can we meet? Want to talk to you. Emma's heart did an odd little flip as she typed back. Library at 7? His response was immediate. I'll be there. The hours until 7 seemed to both drag and fly simultaneously. Emma found herself checking her appearance in the bathroom mirror during her break, wondering why she cared that her hair was messy, or that her bargain store sweater had a small hole in the sleeve. This was just a follow-up meeting with a student, nothing more. But when she arrived at the library and saw Jake waiting at their usual table with 2 coffees and an expression of barely contained excitement, she knew she'd been lying to herself. Jake stood up when he saw her approaching, and the grin on his face told Emma everything she needed to know before he said a word. I did it, he said, his voice full of wonder. Emma, I actually understood the problems. I worked through them, showed my work, got answers that made sense. I'm not saying I aced it, but I'm pretty sure I passed. Maybe even got a B if I'm lucky. Emma felt a surge of pride and relief so strong it almost took her breath away. Jake, that's amazing. I knew you could do it. No, you're amazing, Jake corrected, moving around the table to stand closer to her. You took someone who couldn't solve a basic equation 2 weeks ago and turned him into someone who actually understands calculus. You performed a miracle. It wasn't a miracle, Emma said, though she couldn't stop smiling. It was hard work and dedication, mostly on your part. I just provided guidance. Stop downplaying what you did, Jake said, and there was an intensity in his eyes that made Emma's smile fade into something more uncertain. You changed everything for me. Not just the math, but the way I think about learning, about myself, about what's possible when someone actually believes in you. They were standing very close now, close enough that Emma could see the flecks of gold in Jake's dark eyes, could smell the faint scent of his cologne, mixed with coffee and autumn air. The library noise seemed to fade into background static as the space between them became charged with unspoken possibility. Jake, Emma said softly, uncertain what she was about to say but feeling like something needed to be said. He reached up slowly, giving her plenty of time to pull away, and gently tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. His fingers lingered against her cheek for just a moment, and Emma found herself leaning into the touch before her rational mind could override the impulse. I know this is probably a terrible idea, Jake murmured. I know we're from completely different worlds and you probably think I'm just some rich kid who can't handle his privileged life. But these past 2 weeks, getting to know you, seeing how you think and what you care about, and the way you light up when you're explaining a particularly elegant solution to a problem. Emma, you're the most genuine, brilliant, beautiful person I've ever met. Emma's heart was pounding so hard she was certain Jake could hear it. Every rational part of her brain was screaming that this was a bad idea, that she had no time for complications, that getting involved with someone from a completely different social class would only lead to heartbreak. But there was another part of her, smaller and quieter but growing stronger, that wanted to take the risk, to see where this unexpected connection might lead. It is a terrible idea, she whispered back. But she didn't step away. Then why does it feel so right? Jake asked, his hand still gentle against her cheek. Before Emma could answer, before she could think too hard about all the reasons this was complicated and probably unwise, she made a decision. She rose up on her toes and kissed him, a gentle brush of lips that was more question than statement, more hope than certainty. For a heartbeat, Jake seemed frozen in surprise. Then he responded, his arms coming around her waist as he kissed her back with a sweetness that made Emma's careful walls crumble just a little. It was a kiss full of possibility and promise, the kind that marks a moment when everything changes. When they finally pulled apart, both slightly breathless, Emma couldn't help but laugh at the absurdity of it all. I can't believe I just did that in the middle of the library. Best study session ever, Jake said with a grin that made him look younger and more carefree than Emma had ever seen him. They stood there for another moment, wrapped in each other in the tentative joy of new connection, before reality began to intrude. Emma stepped back, trying to gather her scattered thoughts. This is complicated, she said, needing to voice the concerns even as part of her wanted to ignore them. I'm barely keeping my head above water with my schedule, and you're dealing with family pressure and your own challenges. Plus, we're from such different backgrounds. Your watch costs more than I spend on food in 3 months. How is this supposed to work? Jake's expression grew more serious, but he didn't look discouraged. I don't know, he admitted, but I think you're worth figuring it out. If you want to try, I mean. If I'm not completely overstepping or misreading what just happened. Emma looked at him, at this unexpected person who'd stumbled into her carefully controlled life and somehow made space for himself, despite all her plans and schedules and rigid boundaries. She thought about his dedication over the past 2 weeks, the way he'd shown up and done the work even when it was hard, the vulnerability he'd shared about his family struggles. She thought about how he made her laugh during their sessions, and how he always brought her coffee and how he looked at her like she was remarkable rather than just competent. I want to try, she heard herself say, but slowly, okay? I still need to keep my scholarship and my job and my sanity, and that means I can't let anything distract me from my priorities. Understood, Jake said, his smile returning. Slow and steady. Though I reserve the right to bring you coffee and walk you home from the library, and generally try to make your absurdly difficult life a little easier whenever possible. Over the following weeks, Emma and Jake navigated the uncertain waters of their new relationship with a caution that seemed almost comical to their friends. Jake continued to meet Emma at the library most evenings, though now they spent less time on calculus and more time studying their own coursework side by side, occasionally looking up to share a smile or a quick kiss when they thought no one was watching. True to his word, Jake made Emma's life easier in small, thoughtful ways. He brought her favorite coffee without being asked, learned her schedule so he could walk her back to her dorm after late shifts at the bookstore, and even started packing extra snacks to share during their study sessions, because he'd noticed she often skipped meals when she was busy. For her part, Emma found herself opening up in ways she'd never expected, sharing stories about her childhood and her mother, her dreams for the future, her fears about money and stability, and whether she'd ever feel like she truly belonged at a place like Riverside. Jake listened with genuine interest, asking thoughtful questions and never once making her feel like her struggles were trivial or her background was something to be ashamed of. But they kept their relationship relatively quiet. Not because either was ashamed, but because Emma worried about the attention it might draw. Jake was known on campus, the football player from a wealthy family, the guy everyone assumed had life figured out. And Emma was nobody, just another scholarship student trying to stay afloat. She didn't want to become the subject of gossip or speculation, didn't want people wondering what Jake saw in her or assuming she was using him for his money. Jake seemed to understand this without her having to explain it in detail. He kept their affection private, never pushing for more than Emma was comfortable with, never pressuring her to attend social events or parties where she'd feel out of place. It was a quiet kind of relationship, built on late-night study sessions and early morning coffee dates before classes, stolen moments between obligations, conversations that stretched into hours without either of them noticing the time passing. Then, about 6 weeks into their relationship, everything changed. Emma arrived at the library for their usual evening session to find Jake pacing near their corner table, his phone pressed to his ear and his expression stormy. She hesitated, not wanting to interrupt, but he saw her and waved her over, though his attention remained on his phone conversation. I understand that, Father. But I don't agree with it, Jake was saying, his voice tight with controlled frustration. Because it's not honest. Because people deserve to know the truth about what they're buying. Because short-term profits built on deception always collapse eventually. There was a long pause during which Emma could hear the sharp sound of a raised voice on the other end. Jake's jaw clenched, a muscle twitching in his cheek. That's exactly the kind of thinking that's wrong with corporate culture, Jake said. And if you can't see that, then maybe I'm not the right person to take over the company after all. Another pause, shorter this time. Then Jake said quietly, I need some time to think. I'll call you back later. He ended the call and stood there for a moment, breathing hard, before seeming to remember Emma was watching. His expression softened immediately when he looked at her. Sorry, he said. Bad timing for a family argument. What's going on? Emma asked, concerned by the level of tension she'd witnessed. Jake ran a hand through his hair, a gesture she'd come to recognize as his response to stress. My father wants me to lie in a business proposal. Not directly lie, but withhold information that clients should have, present numbers in a way that's technically true but fundamentally misleading. And when I said I wasn't comfortable with that, he told me I'm being naive and idealistic, and that I'll never make it in the real business world with that attitude. Emma set down her backpack and moved closer, placing a gentle hand on his arm. What did you say? That maybe I don't want to make it in a business world that requires compromising my integrity, Jake said, which did not go over well, as you might imagine. He laughed, but there was no humor in it. The thing is, Emma, I've been doing a lot of thinking lately about what I actually want from life, about whether I want to follow the path my family has laid out for me or forge my own direction. And being with you, Seeing how you live your values even when it's hard, even when it costs you something, it's made me realize I've been a coward. You're not a coward, Emma protested. You are the bravest person I know when it comes to the things that really matter. But yeah, when it comes to standing up to my family, to risking their disappointment and anger, I've always just gone along with what they wanted. Until now. Jake's hand covered hers where it rested on his arm. I think I want to change my major. Switch to education maybe. Or social work, something where I'm actually helping people instead of just helping rich people get richer. Emma's heart swelled with pride and affection, but she also felt a flicker of concern. Jake, that's a huge decision. Your family is going to lose their minds? Disown me? Cut me off financially? Jake finished. Yeah, probably. But I can't keep living for their expectations. I need to figure out who I am and what I actually want, not just be what they need me to be. Emma studied his face, seeing the determination there mixed with fear and uncertainty. This was a crossroads moment, she realized, the kind where Jake would define who he was going to be for the rest of his life. And she understood, perhaps better than he knew, the weight of that decision. Whatever you decide to do, Emma said carefully, make sure you're doing it for yourself, not for me or as a reaction against your father. Because if you make this choice out of rebellion, or because you think it's what I want to hear, you'll regret it eventually. But if you make it because it's genuinely what you want, because you've looked at the options and decided this is your path, then it's worth whatever consequences come with it. Jake looked at her with such intensity that Emma felt exposed, as if he could see straight through all her carefully maintained boundaries to the vulnerabilities underneath. How do you always know exactly the right thing to say? I don't, Emma admitted. Most of the time I'm making it up as I go along, just like everyone else. But I've learned that the decisions you make for the right reasons are the ones you can live with, even when they're hard. The ones you make for the wrong reasons are the ones that eat at you. Jake nodded slowly, seeming to absorb this. Then he pulled Emma into a hug, holding her tightly as if she were an anchor in a storm. Thank you, he murmured into her hair. For seeing me. For caring about me figuring out what I actually want, not just what's convenient for you or anyone else. They stood like that for a long moment before pulling apart and attempting to focus on their actual studying. But Emma could tell Jake's mind was elsewhere, working through problems far more complex than anything in his textbook. In the days that followed, Jake seemed to be engaged in an internal battle. He attended his classes and football practices mechanically, going through the motions without his usual engagement. He spent hours researching alternative majors and career paths, reading about educational theory and social impact work with an intensity he'd never shown for business administration. Emma watched this transformation with mixed feelings. She was proud of Jake for questioning his predetermined path, for considering what he actually wanted from life. But she also worried about the fallout, about whether his family's reaction would destroy the progress he'd made, about whether he'd end up resenting her if their relationship had catalyzed a decision he later regretted. 2 weeks after the phone call she'd witnessed, Jake asked Emma to meet him at a small coffee shop off campus, somewhere they'd never been before. She found him sitting at a corner table, 2 cups already waiting, and knew from his expression that something significant had happened. I did it, Jake said as soon as she sat down. I talked to my academic advisor this morning and filed the paperwork to change my major to education with a focus on mathematics. And then I called my father and told him. Emma's heart leapt with a combination of joy and apprehension. What did he say? Jake's laugh was bitter. Pretty much what I expected. That I'm throwing away my future, embarrassing the family, proving that I'm as much of a disappointment as he'd feared, that I'm choosing poverty and insignificance over the opportunity to lead a multi-million-dollar company, that I'm making this decision because of some girl who's obviously a bad influence. Emma flinched at that last part, and Jake reached across the table to take her hand. I told him that the girl in question is the best thing that's ever happened to me, that she's brilliant and compassionate and has more integrity in her little finger than our entire board of directors combined. And that if he can't see that, he's the one who's blind. Jake, Emma said, torn between being touched and being horrified. I don't want to be the reason your family relationships fall apart. You're not, Jake said firmly. They're falling apart because they're built on conditions and expectations rather than actual love and acceptance. You're just the catalyst that helped me see it. There's a difference. Emma wanted to believe that, but she couldn't shake the feeling that she'd somehow disrupted Jake's life in ways that might hurt him down the road. What happens now? Now, Jake said, and there was a lightness in his voice she hadn't heard since before that phone call 2 weeks ago. I figure out how to live on a normal person's budget, because my father has made it clear that if I'm not following the family plan, I'm not getting family money. I'm going to need to get a job, probably take out student loans, maybe move to cheaper housing. Basically, I'm going to live the way you've been living all along. Emma felt a surge of worry. Jake, that's really hard. It's one thing to romanticize financial struggle from the outside, but actually living it is exhausting and stressful and not some noble adventure. I know it won't be easy, Jake acknowledged, but honestly, I feel lighter than I have in years. Like I can finally breathe. Yeah, I'm scared about money and disappointing my family and all of it. But for the first time, I'm making my own choices, living my own life. And that's worth the struggle. Looking at his face, at the genuine peace there despite the turmoil of his circumstances, Emma found herself believing him. Maybe, she thought, freedom really was worth the price. Even when that price was steep, the remainder of Jake's semester was a crash course in financial reality. He moved out of his fraternity house, no longer able to afford the dues, into a tiny studio apartment on the edge of campus that was smaller than his childhood walk-in closet had been. He sold his car, most of his designer clothes, and the expensive watch Emma had noticed that first day, using the money to cover his first few months of rent and basic expenses. He got a job bussing tables at a restaurant near campus and picked up weekend shifts doing landscaping work. Emma watched him adapt with a mixture of admiration and concern. There were moments when she could see the reality of his new situation hitting him, when he calculated how many hours he'd need to work to afford textbooks, when he ate ramen for the 4th night in a row, when he had to turn down social events because he couldn't afford the entry fee. But there were also moments of genuine joy, small victories that meant more, because they were earned rather than given. Jake's relationship with his family remained strained. His father had made good on his threat to cut him off financially, and his mother called weekly to try to convince him to change his mind and come back to the business track. His younger sister was the only family member who seemed to understand his decision, texting him encouragement and occasionally sending care packages of groceries or supplies she claimed she'd accidentally bought too much of. As fall turned to winter and the semester drew toward its close, Jake and Emma's relationship deepened in ways that surprised them both. The challenges Jake was facing would have destroyed a superficial connection, but somehow the struggles brought them closer, creating a foundation built on genuine understanding and shared values, rather than just attraction and chemistry. Emma helped Jake navigate his new financial reality, teaching him the skills she'd developed over years of managing on a tight budget, how to meal prep efficiently, where to find the best deals on textbooks, which campus resources offered free food and supplies. In return, Jake brought a renewed sense of possibility to Emma's carefully controlled life, encouraging her to take small risks, to occasionally do things just because they'd be fun rather than productive, to remember that life was meant to be lived and not just survived. They studied together in Jake's tiny apartment, sharing the single desk and occasionally getting distracted by kisses that turned into longer interludes before they forced themselves back to work. They took walks through the winter campus, talking about their dreams and fears and the futures they were working toward. They supported each other through late-night cramming sessions and the stress of final exams, celebrating small victories and mourning small defeats together. When grades were posted in December, Jake discovered he'd earned a B+ in calculus. Not perfect, but a massive improvement from where he'd started, and proof that he could succeed when he applied himself to something he actually cared about. His other grades had improved too. Now that he was taking classes aligned with his interests, rather than forcing himself through material he found soul-crushing. Emma, despite all the time she'd spent helping Jake and navigating the complications of their relationship, maintained her perfect grade point average and received notification that she'd been selected for a prestigious research assistantship for the spring semester. As winter break approached, Emma prepared to go home to her mother's small apartment, looking forward to a few weeks of home-cooked meals and maternal fussing, even if her mother's place was cramped and had terrible heat. Jake would be staying in town, working extra shifts at the restaurant to save money and avoid the uncomfortable prospect of going home to face his family's continued disapproval. The night before Emma's bus left for her hometown, Jake took her to dinner at a small Thai restaurant, one of the few places they could afford on their combined budgets. Over pad thai and spring rolls, Jake pulled out a small wrapped package. "Early Christmas present," he said, pushing it across the table toward her. Emma unwrapped it carefully to find a framed photograph she didn't recognize at first. Then she realized it was a picture of her in the library, bent over a textbook with that look of intense concentration she got when she was working through a challenging problem. The late afternoon sun was streaming through the window behind her, catching in her dark hair and creating a kind of halo effect. She looked completely absorbed, completely herself, beautiful in an unconscious way. "When did you take this?" Emma asked, her voice catching slightly. "About a month ago," Jake admitted. "You were helping me with that statistics problem and I looked up and saw you like that and I just thought, that's the moment. That's what I want to remember about this time in my life, not the stress or the family drama or the financial struggles, but this. You. The way you look when you're doing what you love. When you're completely in your element. The way you lit up my entire world just by being yourself." Emma felt tears prick her eyes. She'd received gifts before, practical things from her mother, small tokens from friends. But no one had ever given her something that showed they truly saw her, understood what made her her. "Thank you," she managed. "I love it." Winter break passed in a blur of catching up with her mother, sleeping in her childhood bed, and texting Jake updates about her days while he sent her photos of the winter campus and stories about difficult customers at the restaurant. Her mother noticed the change in Emma immediately, the way she smiled at her phone and seemed lighter despite her exhausting schedule. "Tell me about this boy," her mother said one evening over tea, her eyes twinkling with knowing amusement. Emma found herself pouring out the whole story, how she'd agreed to tutor Jake, how they'd connected, how he'd changed his entire life path and been cut off by his family, how they were navigating their relationship alongside their individual challenges. Her mother listened quietly, occasionally asking questions, until Emma finished. "He sounds like a good man," her mother said finally. "Not a perfect man, but a good one. Someone who's willing to grow and change and fight for what matters. That's rare, Mija." "But is it crazy?" Emma asked, voicing the doubt that sometimes crept in during her quieter moments, to be in a serious relationship when we're both struggling just to keep our heads above water? When we're from such different backgrounds, and his family hates me, and we're both so young? Her mother considered this, stirring her tea thoughtfully. "Love is always a little crazy," she said. "And timing is never perfect. I met your father when I was working 2 jobs and he was trying to get his business off the ground. Everyone said we should wait until we were more stable, more established. But if we'd waited for the perfect time, we'd still be waiting, and I wouldn't have you." Emma knew the rest of that story, how her father had died in a construction accident when she was 3, how her mother had been left alone with a toddler and mountains of debt, how they'd rebuilt their lives from that tragedy into something small but stable. "The question isn't whether it's crazy," her mother continued. "The question is whether he's worth it, whether the relationship adds to your life or takes away from it, whether he makes you better or just makes you tired." Emma thought about Jake's coffee deliveries and study sessions, his genuine interest in her work and her dreams, The way he encouraged her to take care of herself when she was running on fumes. She thought about how he'd faced his family's disapproval rather than compromise his values. How he'd adapted to financial struggle without complaining or giving up. "He makes me better," Emma said quietly. "Even when it's complicated. Even when it adds stress. He makes me want to be braver, and more open, and more willing to take risks. He makes me believe in possibilities I'd written off as unrealistic." Her mother smiled and reached across to squeeze Emma's hand. "Then you have your answer." When Emma returned to campus in January, she found Jake waiting at the bus station with a single rose, not a dozen, because that was outside his budget, but one perfect flower that meant more than any extravagant gesture could have. "I missed you," he said simply, pulling her into a hug that felt like coming home. Spring semester began with new challenges and opportunities for both of them. Emma started her research assistantship, working with a professor on a complex data analysis project that was far more advanced than anything she'd tackled before. The work was demanding, but exhilarating, confirming her love of mathematics and its practical applications. Jake threw himself into his education coursework with the same dedication he'd once given to football, discovering a genuine passion for teaching and learning theory. He volunteered as a tutor at a local high school, working with students from low-income backgrounds, and came back from each session energized and full of stories about his students' progress. They still studied together most evenings, though now in Jake's tiny apartment more often than the library, sharing the space and occasionally cooking simple meals together. Emma taught Jake how to make her mother's rice and beans recipe, while Jake introduced her to the meditation techniques he was learning in his mindfulness and education class. Their relationship wasn't perfect. They had arguments about time management and priorities, moments of frustration when stress levels were high and patience was low, occasional misunderstandings that required careful communication to resolve. But they learned to navigate these challenges, developing patterns of honesty and repair that strengthened rather than weakened their bond. In March, Emma received news that made her entire world shift. She'd been accepted into the graduate program in data science at a prestigious university across the country, with full funding and a generous stipend. It was the opportunity she'd been working toward for years, the culmination of countless hours of study and sacrifice. It was also 3,000 miles away from Riverside and Jake. When she told him, sitting in his apartment with the acceptance letter in her shaking hands, Jake was quiet for a long moment. Then he smiled, and Emma could see both genuine happiness and grief in his expression. "That's amazing," he said, and his voice held no resentment, only pride. "Emma, that's everything you've worked for. I'm so proud of you." "It's also across the country," Emma pointed out, needing to acknowledge the complication they were both thinking about. "It means leaving in August. It means long distance or—" She couldn't quite bring herself to finish that sentence. "It means we have decisions to make," Jake finished gently. "But not tonight. Tonight we celebrate this incredible achievement. The rest we can figure out as we go." But the question hung between them through the spring, an approaching deadline they couldn't ignore forever. Could their relationship survive long distance? Should they even try? Or would it be kinder to make a clean break? And if they did try to make it work, what would that look like when they were both struggling to manage their immediate responsibilities, let alone coordinate across time zones? The weeks that followed Emma's acceptance were bittersweet, filled with the excitement of her accomplishment shadowed by the awareness of the impending separation. They tried to focus on the present, on making the most of the time they had left. But the future was always there, a countdown clock ticking in the background of every moment. In April, Emma received an unexpected phone call from Jake's sister, whose number she'd never actually had before. "Hi, Emma. This is Sarah, Jake's sister. I know this is kind of weird, but I wanted to reach out. Do you have a few minutes to talk?" Puzzled, Emma agreed, stepping out of the library where she'd been working on her research project. "I'm coming to campus next week," Sarah explained. "There's this whole family thing going down, and I wanted to give you a heads up, because it's going to affect Jake, and by extension, you. Can we meet for coffee?" I think it would be better to explain in person. They arranged to meet at the same small off-campus coffee shop where Jake had told Emma about changing his major. Sarah turned out to be a younger version of Jake, with the same dark eyes and thoughtful expression, but more openly warm and immediately friendly. "Okay, so here's the situation," Sarah said once they both had their drinks. "My dad is sick, like really sick. Heart condition that's getting worse. And the doctors are saying he needs to slow down, reduce stress, maybe step back from running the company. And suddenly everyone in the family is panicking, because the succession plan was always that Jake would take over eventually. But now, Jake's gone and become a teacher." She said it without judgment, but Emma could hear the family drama implicit in those words. "What does that mean for Jake?" Emma asked carefully. "It means Dad wants him to come back," Sarah said. "He's going to make Jake an offer, come back to the business track, rejoin the family company trajectory, and all will be forgiven. Full financial support. Trust fund reinstated. Basically everything he lost when he changed majors. And if Jake refuses, Dad's going to hand everything to our cousin Marcus, who's a complete snake and will probably run the company into the ground within 5 years. Emma felt a chill settle in her stomach. "Does Jake know about this?" "Not yet. Dad's planning to tell him this weekend. I wanted to warn you first because I figured you should be prepared." Sarah leaned forward, her expression intense. "Look, I love my brother, and I think what he's doing, following his own path, being with you, is brave and important. But I also know Jake, and I know he's going to feel guilty about the company, about Dad's health, about the employees whose jobs might be at risk if Marcus takes over. He's going to be torn up about this." "What do you think he should do?" Emma asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to hear the answer. Sarah was quiet for a moment, considering. "I think he should do whatever makes him happy, whatever lets him sleep at night. But I also think he needs to know that whatever he chooses, he has support. From me, definitely. And hopefully from you." "Of course from me," Emma said immediately. "Whatever he decides, I'm with him." But even as she said it, Emma felt doubt creeping in. Was that true? If Jake chose to go back to his family's business, would she still want to be with him? Would he still be the person she'd fallen in love with? Or would he gradually transform back into the version of himself he'd been trying to escape? That weekend, Jake's father came to campus. Emma wasn't present for the conversation, but she saw Jake afterward, and the devastation on his face told her everything she needed to know. They walked through the spring campus without speaking for a long time, Jake's hands shoved in his pockets and his shoulders hunched against more than just the cool evening breeze. "He's sick," Jake finally said, "really sick. And he told me the company needs me, that I'm being selfish by pursuing teaching, that I'm putting my own desires ahead of the family legacy and the hundreds of employees who depend on the company's success. He said if I don't come back, I'm basically killing his legacy and potentially destroying everything he's built." Emma listened, her heart aching for the impossible position Jake was in. "What do you want to do?" "I don't know," Jake said, and his voice was raw with confusion and pain. "Part of me wants to tell him where he can shove his legacy and his guilt trips, but another part of me feels like maybe he's right. Maybe I am being selfish. What if the company does fail under Marcus? What if jobs are lost because I wanted to follow my dreams instead of my responsibilities?" They found themselves at their old corner table in the library, the place where this had all started, and sat across from each other in heavy silence. Emma wanted to tell Jake what to do, wanted to make this decision easier for him. But she knew this was something he had to work through himself. "Can I tell you something?" Emma finally said. Jake nodded, looking at her with exhausted hope, as if she might have some answer he hadn't considered. "When I was deciding whether to accept the graduate school offer, I talked to my mom about it. And she told me that she and my dad used to have this saying, 'You can't live someone else's life for them, no matter how much you love them.' She said it about my dad's family, who wanted him to give up his construction business and work in their restaurant. But it applies here too. Emma took a deep breath and continued. Your father's company, his legacy, the employees, those are all real considerations, but they're not your responsibility just because you were born into a particular family. You didn't choose to be the heir. You didn't sign a contract saying you'd sacrifice your own happiness and calling for the sake of family expectations. And yes, maybe Marcus will do a terrible job. Or maybe your father will find someone else to take over who's actually passionate about business and will do better than you ever would have, because it's their genuine calling. Jake was listening intently now, some of the tension easing from his shoulders. The company survived before you, and it will survive after you, Emma said gently. But you only get one life, Jake. And if you spend it doing what other people think you should do instead of what you actually want, you're going to wake up at 50 and realize you've been living someone else's dream while your own withered away. Jake reached across the table and took her hand. What about you? What about us? If I stay on the education track, I'll probably end up teaching at some underfunded school district, making barely enough to live on. If I go back to business, I can offer you a completely different kind of life. Financial security, opportunities, resources. Isn't that worth considering? Emma felt tears prick her eyes because she understood what he was really asking. Would she still love him if he couldn't offer her material comfort? Jake, I fell in love with the guy who showed up here every night exhausted from football practice but determined to understand calculus. I fell in love with the person who changed his entire life because he wanted to live with integrity. I fell in love with you when you had nothing to offer me but yourself. Do you really think I'd suddenly care about money now? I just want to be able to give you the things you deserve, Jake said. You've worked so hard, sacrificed so much. I want to make your life easier, not add to your burdens. Then make the choice that lets you be fully yourself, Emma said firmly, because the only version of you that would be a burden is one who's miserable and resentful because he gave up his dreams. I don't need wealth or status or any of that. I need you to be whole and happy and living a life you chose. Jake was quiet for a long moment, and Emma could almost see him working through the decision in his mind, weighing all the factors, finally letting go of the guilt and obligation that had been weighing him down. I'm staying on the education track, he said finally, and his voice was clear and certain. I'll help my father find a qualified CEO to take over, someone who actually wants to run the company. I'll stay involved in family decisions if they want me to be, but I'm not giving up teaching. And if that means I'm not the son they wanted, then that's something we're all going to have to learn to live with. Emma felt a fierce surge of pride and relief. I think that's incredibly brave. Or incredibly stupid, Jake said. But he was smiling now. Time will tell. They talked late into the night, making plans and facing the reality of their upcoming separation. Jake had one more year at Riverside before he'd start student teaching. Emma would be gone for at least 5 years completing her graduate degree. Long distance would be hard. Probably the hardest thing either of them had faced. But they'd faced hard things before and survived. They made promises to each other, to visit when they could afford it, to video call regularly, to be honest about struggles and challenges rather than pretending everything was fine. They acknowledged that the relationship might not survive the distance, that sometimes love wasn't enough when life pulled people in different directions, but they agreed to try, to give it their best effort, because what they had was worth fighting for. When graduation came in May, Emma sat in the audience and watched Jake walk across the stage to receive his diploma with his new major listed. His family wasn't there. They'd boycotted the ceremony in protest of his choices. But Sarah was there, cheering loudly, and Emma was there, filled with pride and love and hope for the future. Summer came, and with it Emma's preparations to leave. Jake helped her pack her few belongings, drove with her to the airport in the borrowed car of a friend, held her hand through every moment of the countdown. At the security checkpoint, they clung to each other, both crying, both trying to be brave. This isn't goodbye forever, Jake said into her hair. It's just goodbye for now. I love you, Emma whispered back. That doesn't change just because I'm 3,000 miles away. Years later, Emma would stand in that same library corner where it had all begun. But this time, she wouldn't be alone. Jake would be beside her, a ring on his finger matching the one on hers, having moved cross-country after finishing his teaching degree to join her where she'd built her career. He'd be teaching at an inner-city high school, making a fraction of what he could have earned in his family's business. And he'd be completely, radiantly happy. They'd tell their story to anyone who asked. How a struggling student and a dedicated tutor had found each other in a corner of a university library. How they'd chosen love and authenticity over expectations and security. How sometimes the hardest paths lead to the most beautiful destinations. But all of that was still ahead of them, as Emma walked through airport security and turned back for one last wave. Jake stood there until she was out of sight, then whispered to the empty air, "I'll wait for you. However long it takes." And he